Hey guys, tonight we begin with something very relatable, dating. Or more accurately, how people dated in the medieval world. Which, spoiler alert, turns out to be far weirder, far stricter, and far muddier than swiping left or right. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Now, dating today is already stressful. Text someone too fast and you look desperate. Text them too late and you look cold. Meet the parents too soon and you're rushing things. Meet them too late and they assume you're hiding something. Imagine all that awkwardness, but without the convenience of texting, coffee shops, or apps that pretend to know your soulmate based on a handful of swipes. Imagine instead a world where falling in love is a legal transaction, where flirting might involve passing a token across a crowded feast, and where, "Are you free Friday night?" really means, are your families prepared to negotiate the transfer of 3 cows, a goose, and maybe a small patch of land? Yes, dating in the Middle Ages was awkward, complicated, and, depending on your social class, it might not even exist in the way we think of it. For nobles, marriage wasn't about romance. It was about alliance, about binding 2 families in a treaty stronger than any parchment. If you were born into nobility, congratulations, you were a walking contract. Your smile, your hand, your entire life was a chess piece to be moved across the board of politics. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's set the scene. Imagine a stone castle, drafty and cold, torches flickering against damp walls. In the great hall, nobles gather, goblets clinking, laughter rising like smoke. Somewhere in the room, a young knight glances at a lady across the hall. Does he dare approach? Not without a chaperone hovering like a hawk. Not without a series of elaborate rules that make modern dating look refreshingly simple. And then, outside the castle walls, in the muddy villages, peasants are living a completely different rhythm. They don't have troubadours composing odes to their unattainable love. They don't pass silken ribbons as tokens of desire. They meet at church festivals, at the well, during harvest. For them, love is practical. Can this person work alongside you in the fields? Can they survive a hard winter without collapsing? Do they have a decent dowry, maybe a cow or 2, or at least the prospect of inheriting a sturdy roof? Already you can see the divide. For nobles, love is performance. For peasants, it's survival. But here's the catch. Even though marriage was supposed to be practical, humans have always been messy. People still fell in love with the wrong person. Still exchanged glances when they shouldn't have. Still dreamed of eloping when the family said no. The church might have thundered about obedience, fathers might have drawn up contracts, but hearts? Hearts went where they pleased, even in the 12th century. And that's where our story begins. Tonight we're going to wander through the crooked lanes of medieval romance. We'll peek into castles and cottages, into monasteries and markets. We'll meet knights who swore eternal love but meant it more like a poem than a promise. We'll see peasants trying to scrape together dowries while dodging nosy neighbors. We'll explore the superstitions that whispered which day was lucky to wed and which was cursed. And we'll laugh, because truly, medieval dating was a mix of sincerity, absurdity, and pure human longing that doesn't feel so different from our own, just with more mud and fewer emojis. So let's step into this world together. Imagine yourself back in the year 1250. Maybe you're the daughter of a minor nobleman, sitting by the window embroidering, waiting to hear which lord your father intends to trade you off to. Or maybe you're a young peasant lad, nervously approaching a girl at the midsummer festival, wondering if she'll accept your crude wooden brooch as a token. Or maybe you're a monk, supposed to be celibate, but writing suspiciously romantic letters under the guise of spiritual advice. In any case, one thing is certain, love has always been complicated. And in the medieval world, it was a battlefield in its own right. If you were born into a medieval family of means, your first experience of dating wasn't romantic at all. It was transactional. Forget candlelit dinners or awkward first dates where you debate who should pay for the bill. In the Middle Ages, the bill had already been tallied long before you even met your potential partner. And instead of deciding whether to split a pizza, the decision was whether your family could afford to part with 3 geese, a chest of linens, and perhaps, if things were really serious, a small plot of farmland. Arranged marriages were the medieval equivalent of Tinder. But instead of swiping, your family did the choosing. And instead of profile pictures filtered to perfection, your bio was your family's reputation, your land holdings, and how many cows you could reasonably promise as collateral. Now, let's be clear, arranged marriage wasn't unique to medieval Europe. It's a practice as old as civilization itself. But in the Middle Ages, it became institutionalized, especially among the nobility. Marriage wasn't about love, it was about land, power, and alliance. If you were a noblewoman, you might have been betrothed as a child, essentially locked into a future with a man you wouldn't meet until you were of marriageable age, and if you were a nobleman, your wife's dowry could mean the difference between financial ruin and a flourishing estate. So, what exactly was a dowry? Think of it as a starter pack for married life, except it wasn't given to the bride and groom directly. It was handed over to the groom's family as a kind of insurance. Here, the bride's family was essentially saying, "Take our daughter. And also take these cows, this silver goblet, and the tapestry. Please, treat her well." And the size of that dowry mattered. Imagine the gossip. Lady Margaret only brought 2 cows into the marriage, while Lady Agnes came with a full vineyard. Dowries were, quite literally, a measure of a woman's worth in the marriage market. Harsh? Yes. Accurate? Also yes. But it wasn't just nobles. Peasants also relied on dowries, though on a much smaller scale. A peasant girl's dowry might be a goat, a few hens, or a sturdy blanket woven by her mother. And yet, even these modest offerings could delay or derail a marriage if they weren't sufficient. Imagine falling in love at the village festival, only to be told your beloved's family can't come up with enough hens to satisfy yours. Love denied, not because of feuding families or star-crossed destinies, but because of poultry economics. And here's where things get even stranger. Because while arranged marriages were common, the church had a very different idea. Canon law stated that a valid marriage required consent from both parties. Yes, believe it or not, the medieval church was big on the idea that both bride and groom should say, "I do," of their own free will. In theory. In practice? Well, what counted as free will when your family had already spent years negotiating your dowry? When refusing might mean dishonoring your parents, losing political alliances, or being cast out with no prospects. The line between consent and coercion blurred constantly. And yet, stories abound of young people pushing back. Sometimes they eloped, choosing passion over politics. Sometimes they sought the church's protection, arguing that their parents were forcing them into an unwanted match. There are recorded cases of medieval courts siding with lovers who married in secret, recognizing their union even against family wishes. It was rare, but it happened. Still, most people accepted the system. Because marriage was survival. A good match could mean financial security, social mobility, even safety. A bad match could mean poverty, dishonor, or worse. Now, imagine the social rituals around all this. Nobles gathered in great halls to negotiate contracts, while scribes recorded every detail, the names, the lands, the dowry items. It was less like a wedding proposal and more like a real estate transaction. Meanwhile, in the village, parents whispered over mugs of ale, calculating whether their daughter's woolen blanket and goat could secure her a decent husband. It all sounds deeply unromantic. And yet, love still found its cracks. Troubadour songs, written in courts from France to Italy, sang of knights pining for ladies beyond their reach. Peasants stole moments together during festivals, slipping tokens, like ribbons or carved trinkets, as silent promises. Even within the rigid system, humans couldn't resist making it messy. What's fascinating is how many of these rituals echo in our own lives, just reshaped. Modern dating apps list hobbies, jobs, and interests. Medieval apps were land deeds, livestock, and family connections. Swipe left on the poor farmer with no dowry. Swipe right on the lady whose father controls a fertile valley. And the chaperones? They were the medieval version of nosy algorithms, watching your every move, making sure you didn't stray outside the approved matches. But here's the kicker, for all the rigidity, the stakes were just as high as they feel today. People wanted security. They wanted love, if possible. They wanted to avoid disaster. And beneath the cows, the contracts, and the gossip, the same question lingered that lingers now: will this person make my life better, or worse? The difference is that in the Middle Ages, the answer wasn't just personal, it could determine the fate of entire families, estates, even kingdoms. If medieval arranged marriages were the cold business side of romance, then courtly love was the glittering stage show. Think of it as medieval Europe's version of a rom-com, except with fewer jokes, more poetry, and a lot of very dramatic sighing. Courtly love was less about building a life together and more about showcasing the art of longing. It blossomed in the 12th century, especially in the courts of France, where troubadours, poet-musicians with too much time and probably too much wine, sang about knights hopelessly devoted to unattainable ladies. And here's the twist: the lady was usually married. Often to a powerful lord. So right away, you've got a script that's part romance, part social risk, part don't get caught or you'll lose your head. Picture it. A knight returns from battle, armor clanking, sword shining. He's brave, noble, maybe missing a tooth or two, but full of passion. Across the hall sits a lady in a gown worth more than his horse, the wife of his lord. He gazes at her with a look that says, "I would joust 100 men for you," and she gazes back, because it's flattering, isn't it? But she never says yes. That's the core of courtly love, unfulfilled desire. The more impossible the love, the more noble the longing. Troubadours even wrote manuals, full of rules. Rule 1, keep it secret. Rule 2, always flatter. Rule 3, the more obstacles, the better the love. It was, essentially, romance as a performance sport. But don't confuse it with actual marriage. In fact, it thrived precisely because marriage was so transactional. People craved an outlet for passion, so they invented this parallel game where love could be played out in poetry, songs, and carefully staged encounters. Tokens were exchanged: ribbons, gloves, handkerchiefs. Imagine medieval texting, but instead of WYD, you hand over a silk ribbon at a feast, and it carries an entire world of meaning. And then there were tournaments. Knights wore their lady's favor, a scarf or brooch, while charging into the lists. It wasn't just about winning the joust. It was about showing devotion, proving yourself worthy through feats of arms. Love and violence, always intertwined. But don't be fooled, all of this was tightly policed by society. And that's where the chaperone enters the scene. If you think your parents were strict when you were 16, imagine living in a world where nearly every interaction between men and women was supervised. Noble daughters, especially, rarely went anywhere without a duenna or maid trailing behind. The chaperone was a mix of bodyguard, spy, and emotional border patrol. Her job? To make sure you didn't get too close to the wrong person. A knight might pour out his heart in poetry, but if he tried to actually meet the lady alone? Cue the chaperone, stepping in like a medieval bouncer. Nope. You're not on the list. And yet, humans being humans, they found loopholes. Letters slipped under doors. Whispered words in gardens. A glance held a second too long across a feast table. Even the strictest chaperone couldn't monitor every heartbeat. Sometimes these romances burned bright enough to become legend. Think of Lancelot and Guinevere, Arthur's queen, an affair immortalized in countless tales. It was dangerous, yes, but irresistible. The stories themselves reveal just how captivated medieval society was by this dance between passion and duty. Meanwhile, peasants had their own versions. No troubadours singing in their cottages, but plenty of flirting at festivals, songs sung during harvest, playful games that gave young men and women a chance to mingle. Still chaperoned, of course, neighbors and parents were always watching, but with more wiggle room than the nobility, because life was too hard to waste time on endless sighing. And the church? Oh, the church was skeptical of courtly love. Clergy warned against lust dressed up as poetry. But at the same time, even monks wrote letters that suspiciously blurred the line between spiritual devotion and romantic passion. Bernard of Clairvaux's descriptions of the soul's love for Christ read uncannily like the lyrics of a very intense love ballad. So, what did courtly love achieve? In one sense, it gave medieval people a fantasy world where passion was allowed to exist. In another, it was a carefully contained system, safe, as long as it stayed in poetry and didn't spill too far into reality. And isn't that familiar? Today we watch romantic dramas, scroll through carefully curated social media relationships, and sigh over love stories that are larger than life. Courtly love was the medieval prototype, the fantasy that made real-life arranged marriages slightly more bearable. The chaperones may have tried to contain it, but they couldn't erase it. Because at the end of the day, love, whether real, imagined, or forbidden, always found a way to complicate the script. Imagine sliding into someone's DMs in the 13th century. No Instagram, no WhatsApp, not even the humble paper note we passed in school classrooms. Instead, your options were creative. If you were wealthy, parchment was expensive but possible. If you were a peasant, well, you might carve your affection into wood, or whisper it into a song at festival time. Either way, every attempt at communication came with one huge problem: secrecy. In a world filled with chaperones, nosy relatives, and the church breathing down everyone's necks, private love notes were as risky as smuggling contraband. Let's start with the nobility. Among them, letters were an art form. Knights and ladies composed missives filled with exaggerated metaphors. Your eyes are like stars, your hair shines brighter than spun gold, my heart burns hotter than a forge, you know, the usual. But unlike a modern text message, these letters weren't dashed off in seconds. They were crafted, often dictated to scribes or copied from formula books of romantic phrases. Yes, there were medieval manuals for writing love letters. Imagine a society so bound by ritual that even your flirtation had a template. Of course, the risk was enormous. An intercepted letter could ruin reputations, spark duels, or invite church penalties. So lovers got inventive. Some letters were wrapped around small objects, smuggled through servants, or hidden in everyday items. There are stories, half legend, half truth, of knights sending messages tied to falcons' legs, of ribbons passed under banquet tables, of carved initials hidden on tree trunks. Then came tokens. In a world without emojis, tokens were love's shorthand. A handkerchief, a ribbon, a glove, all carried deep meaning. If a knight wore your ribbon on his lance during a tournament, it was a declaration louder than any speech. If a lady received a carved wooden brooch from a peasant suitor, she knew exactly what he meant. Tokens could be scandalously intimate too. A lock of hair, tucked into a pouch and worn close to the heart. A ring slipped secretly into a lover's palm. Even the smallest object pulsed with dangerous meaning. And sometimes, lovers went further still. There's an anecdote, perhaps apocryphal, but too good to ignore, of a fisherman sending his sweetheart a message wrapped around a herring. Practical, yes. Subtle? Not so much. But desperate people will try anything. Among peasants, secrecy was less about scandal and more about logistics. Imagine you're a farm boy trying to woo a girl whose parents expect her home before sundown. Your love note might be a carved symbol left on her path. Your token might be a simple wreath of flowers, tucked onto her doorstep. No parchment, no poetry, but the same beating heart behind it. What's remarkable is how universal this desire for secret communication was. Across Europe, from castles to cottages, lovers found ways to say, "I see you. I want you. I'm thinking of you." And yet, the Church kept a close eye on this behavior. Priests railed against furtive letters that lured young people into sin. Bishops warned of ribbons and trinkets being tokens of the devil's work. But the more they warned, the more people found ways around them. The irony? Some clergy themselves were guilty of it. Monks, supposed to live celibate lives, occasionally wrote letters so flowery they blurred the line between holy devotion and outright romance. "Your soul inspires me to greater love of God," they'd write, but you can practically hear the wink in the ink. So, were these letters and tokens effective? Sometimes. Many a marriage began with a smuggled word, a carefully chosen trinket. But sometimes they ended in disaster, exposure, shame, broken families. It was a high-stakes game, every time. Today we send a text, risk a left on read, maybe suffer a screenshot shared with friends. In the Middle Ages, a misplaced letter could cost you land, status, or your life. And yet, isn't there something charming about the effort? No instant gratification, no emojis, no typing dots. Just the slow burn of words crafted by candlelight, tokens passed with trembling hands, risks taken in the name of love. It reminds us that romance, in all its awkwardness, has always been about the same thing, finding a way to connect, even when the world is against you. For peasants, love rarely unfolded in candlelit chambers with velvet gowns and embroidered favors. It unfolded in mud. In noise. In the chaos of village festivals and fairs, where the serious work of survival briefly gave way to laughter, dancing, and, if fortune smiled, flirting. Life on a medieval farm was relentless. Sunrise to sunset, bodies bent over fields, hands cracked from cold and work. There was little time for mooning about with poetry. But festivals, tied to the church calendar or the rhythm of harvest, were the loophole. Picture a May Day celebration. Flowers woven into garlands, ribbons hanging from poles, pipes and drums calling people to dance. Suddenly, the usual boundaries softened. The girl you only saw trudging to market with a basket on her back was now laughing, cheeks flushed, moving in rhythm with the circle of dancers. Peasants didn't write sonnets. They sang songs. Verses passed from mouth to mouth, often bawdy, often playful. Some were thinly veiled invitations. A boy might sing of a maiden's bright eyes while sneaking a grin in her direction. She might answer with a teasing line, her friends giggling nearby. Fairs, too, were opportunities. The annual market brought people from surrounding villages, swelling the streets with strangers. It was like a medieval dating app. Suddenly, your pool of prospects expanded. And oh, the church worried. Festivals, with their drinking and mingling, were notorious for bending rules. Priests thundered from pulpits about sin, while young men and women stole glances across the ale benches. Folk traditions often blurred sacred and profane. Take the Maying customs. Groups of young people ventured into the woods at dawn to gather greenery. They returned hours later, suspiciously flushed, with more than flowers in their hair. Elders pretended not to notice. The church, of course, noticed plenty. Sermons against unchaste May games echo across the centuries. Courtship at festivals was rarely subtle. There were games, tug-of-war, wrestling, playful contests, that gave boys excuses to show off their strength. There was dancing, with hand-clasping, partner-swapping, and just enough contact to send sparks flying. Imagine the thrill of brushing fingers in a time when touch itself was loaded with meaning. And then, of course, there was drink. Ale flowed freely, loosening tongues and lowering inhibitions. Many a romance began, or ended, in the haze of a festival jug. But don't mistake these moments as frivolous. For peasants, festivals were crucial matchmaking opportunities. Marriages were practical, yes, families weighing land, livestock, alliances, but human attraction still mattered. And festivals gave space for that attraction to surface. Songs and dances weren't just entertainment. They were coded language. The circle dance was a way to lock eyes, to signal interest. The ballad was a way to declare admiration in public without saying it outright. Even the act of offering food or drink carried weight. And then came the love divinations, superstitions about who you'd marry ran wild at festivals. Girls plucked petals from flowers, he loves me not. They poured melted lead into water, interpreting shapes as future husbands' trades. They whispered charms at wells, hoping for visions of their fates. Boys, too, played their part. Tossing apples, carving initials, boasting in song. The line between sincere affection and crude teasing was thin, but somewhere in the mix, real connections formed. Meanwhile, the church tried to regulate. Bishops issued edicts against dancing in churchyards, against songs that inflame lust, against excessive merrymaking. But the people carried on. Because what was life without those bursts of joy? Peasants knew that life was short, fragile, unpredictable. A bad harvest, a sickness, a lord's whim, any could shatter stability. So when the music played, they danced. When the fair arrived, they laughed. And when their hearts stirred, they followed them, at least for an evening. From those muddy fields and crowded market stalls came countless marriages, countless children, countless legacies. Not chronicled in troubadour poems, not written into noble histories, but etched in the living rhythm of villages. And so, love among peasants was less about lofty ideals and more about survival wrapped in celebration. No velvet gloves, no falcons bearing notes, but garlands, laughter, and the beating of drums. And yet, whether peasant or noble, the heart script was the same: longing, risk, joy, fear. Love, even in the mud, was still love. If festivals were the playground of flirtation, marriage negotiations were the boardroom. Nothing stripped the romance out of love faster than sitting around a table with parents, uncles, maybe even a village elder, haggling over cows, coin, and land like it was a medieval stock exchange. Love, in this world, rarely stood alone. It was tied to fields, to dowries, to alliances. Two young people might have liked each other well enough, but their union depended on calculations far beyond personal feelings. For the nobility, the stakes were astronomical. A marriage wasn't just two people, it was entire estates, sometimes kingdoms. Imagine being 15, and told that your fiancé is a boy you've never met, in a castle across the sea. No swiping left, no choice. Only the weight of family strategy. Dowries were central. A daughter didn't just marry, she was endowed. Land, livestock, coin, even household goods, all bundled and sent with her, like an economic starter pack for her husband's household. Families without enough to offer? Their daughters faced fewer prospects, no matter how charming, witty, or beautiful. For sons, the calculation was equally pragmatic. Marrying up could secure more land, more prestige, more power. Marrying poorly could sink fortunes. And so, negotiations unfolded. Picture it, two families seated at a heavy wooden table, parchment and quills at the ready. Voices rising, hands slapping wood, servants shuttling back and forth with ale to keep tempers cool. We can offer 2 cows and 3 acres. Insufficient. She deserves at least 5 acres and a silver goblet. 5 acres? Outrageous. And so it went. Lives bartered like market goods. But don't assume this was purely noble behavior. Peasants, too, conducted their own miniature negotiations. Their marriage markets weren't gilded courts, but church porches and village taverns. Fathers weighed how many chickens their daughters could bring, how many goats their sons could inherit. Love was nice. Survival was nicer. Even so, young people sometimes rebelled. Records survive of marriages made without parental consent. Scandalous. Dangerous. Occasionally, romantic. The church, interestingly, often sided with the couple. As long as vows were exchanged freely, in front of witnesses, the union was valid, even if both families fumed. This loophole created tension for centuries. The church defended the sanctity of mutual consent, while families clung to control. The result? A tug of war, where lovers occasionally seized a fleeting victory. Yet, most marriages still followed the pattern of negotiation. The church porch became the symbolic site, contracts signed outside, vows sealed inside. Witnesses gathered, agreements formalized, hands clasped. Romance? Optional. Obligation? Inevitable. Sometimes negotiations took absurd turns. One story tells of a groom's family backing out at the last minute, because the promised cow was lame. Another describes a dowry chest filled with coins, only to discover they were clipped, their silver edges shaved away. Medieval prenups could collapse faster than modern engagements. But there was humor, too. Popular plays and songs mocked the bargaining process. Villagers laughed at tales of miserly fathers, scheming mothers, bumbling suitors. Satire was a way of coping with the transactional coldness of it all. And yet, beneath the bargaining, human hearts still beat. Many couples grew fond of each other after marriage. Affection blossomed in the daily rhythm of shared work, shared hardship, shared survival. Maybe it wasn't the romance of troubadours, but it was steady. In that way, negotiations weren't the end of love, they were simply the gatekeepers. Those who passed through often built real, enduring bonds. The irony, of course, is that we still see echoes of these negotiations today. Engagement rings, wedding registries, family dinners where parents ask about career prospects. The medieval cow has simply transformed into a down payment on a house. In the end, love met business, and business usually won. But humans, stubborn as ever, found ways to sneak passion through the cracks. Whether in a glance at a fair, a ribbon exchanged, or a whispered promise, outside the watchful eyes of the family. If negotiations were the dry paperwork of love, weddings were the fireworks. These were not quiet ceremonies. They were theater. Public, noisy, extravagant, and above all, memorable. The church service was only the beginning. Yes, there would be vows, rings, or sometimes not rings at all, and a priest droning in Latin. The couple might not even understand every word. But they understood the weight of it. Hands clasped, vows exchanged, God invoked, and suddenly, two lives were bound together. And then, the real show began. Because weddings were spectacles for the community, not just the couple. Imagine bells ringing across the village, neighbors streaming toward the church, the streets buzzing like a festival. Children darting about, dogs barking at the smell of roasting meat, and the bride, dressed in her finest, though maybe not in white. White was not yet the universal rule. Instead, brides wore their best garment, often in rich colors. Red, green, even gold embroidery if the family could afford it. Guests lined up to watch the couple process out of the church, and here's where the spectacle hit its stride. Sometimes the bride would carry symbols of her dowry, or the groom would lead her by the hand, a gesture both tender and slightly possessive. Witnesses cheered, villagers shouted blessings, and from there, it was a march toward the feast. Ah yes, the feast. No medieval wedding was complete without one. Food, endless food, was the true display of wealth. Roast meats dripping with fat. Stews ladled out by the cauldron. Fresh bread piled high. Ale flowing like a river. Nobles displayed their prosperity with exotic spices, sugar, or even peacocks served with feathers reattached for spectacle. Peasants? They stretched what they had: chickens, pottage, cheese. But even the simplest spread mattered, because it showed generosity. A stingy wedding feast was a social disgrace. And feasting was just the beginning. There was music. Drums, fiddles, lutes, and pipes. Troubadours sang bawdy songs, minstrels told jokes, dancers stamped their feet until the hall shook. For peasants, the dancing often spilled into the village square, fires lit against the night. For nobles, the feast might last days, with elaborate dances requiring careful steps, choreographed elegance meant to display refinement. But with food and ale flowing, refinement often broke down. After a few cups, even the stiffest noble was liable to stumble into a jig. Laughter rose, cheeks flushed, inhibitions fell away. Weddings were not solemn, they were rowdy. And don't forget the games. In some regions, villagers would playfully harass the bride and groom, stealing shoes, blocking the bedroom door until they paid a ransom, even staging mock kidnappings. These traditions were half jest, half ritual, reminding the couple that marriage was not purely private, it was woven into the fabric of the whole community. Speaking of community, everyone watched the couple closely. Marriage was not just about love or family, it was about continuity. Would this union produce heirs? Would the household thrive? Guests looked at the pair, smiling and laughing, but also silently measuring the future. And then, of course, came the moment everyone gossiped about, the bedding ceremony. In some cultures, the newlyweds were escorted to their chamber with rowdy encouragement. Guests might toss the couple onto the bed, sing songs, even linger awkwardly outside the door. It sounds invasive, and it was, but it was also symbolic. Marriage wasn't fully considered valid until consummated. The bedding ritual ensured that everyone knew it was about to happen. Imagine the poor bride, exhausted after hours of feasting and dancing, now paraded to bed under the eyes of half the village. Privacy? Minimal. Pressure? Immense. But that was the medieval way. Still, not every detail was solemn duty. There were moments of genuine joy. Couples sneaking glances, friends celebrating with abandon, communities knitting themselves tighter through shared revelry. Even if the marriage was arranged, the wedding itself offered a chance, briefly, for laughter, indulgence, and togetherness. Now, let's not idealize too much. Weddings could also be battlegrounds of social rivalry. Did the groom's family spend enough on the feast? Was the bride's gown elegant or embarrassingly plain? Did someone get too drunk and insult the priest? These things mattered. A misstep at a wedding could spark grudges lasting years. But at their best, weddings were social glue. They reminded everyone of their shared life, of the fields they worked, the faith they held, the lineage they continued. They were spectacles, yes, but also rituals of belonging. And here's the irony. For all the grandeur, for all the feasting, music, and laughter, most couples, by the end of the night, probably felt more exhausted than romantic. Still, in that exhaustion, there was a kind of triumph. The contracts had been signed. The vows spoken. The feast consumed. The songs sung. The dance danced. And now, the rest of life began. The wedding feast is over. The music has faded. The guests have stumbled home, or collapsed in corners of the hall. And now, what happens? This is the part most medieval storytellers skipped. Because after the glamour of vows and the chaos of celebration, came the daily grind. And marriage, in truth, was less about fireworks, and more about firewood. Picture a young couple in a stone cottage. Morning light filters through a narrow window. The husband pulls on boots still damp from yesterday's mud. The wife stokes the hearth, coaxing flame from ash. Their lives are tied together by chores, obligations, and survival. Love in this context was not grand gestures, it was small ones. A husband sharing bread before heading to the fields. A wife patching his tunic without complaint. Quiet teamwork mattered more than poetry. But not all marriages were equal. For some, affection grew naturally. Two people learned to laugh together, to shoulder burdens, to raise children with care. For others, disappointment set in. Imagine marrying someone chosen for you, only to realize they snore like thunder, or spend coin too freely, or have a temper like flint. Divorce? Almost impossible. Annulments were rare, scandalous, and usually only granted to the powerful. Most couples simply endured. The church, of course, preached ideals. A husband should be a protector. A wife should be obedient and nurturing. But reality didn't always match the sermon. Husbands could be harsh, wives could be sharp-tongued. Some marriages were partnerships. Others were battlefields. Children quickly entered the picture. For many women, marriage meant motherhood, almost immediately. Pregnancy after pregnancy, sometimes without pause. Joy when infants survived. Grief when they didn't. The bond between parents could strengthen through shared loss, or fracture under the weight of it. Money added pressure. A good harvest meant relief, even joy. A bad one meant hunger, arguments, and blame. A missing cow or a failed field could ignite tension as sharply as any love affair. Because love alone could not fill bellies. And then there were expectations, social, spiritual, personal. A man was judged by his ability to provide, a woman by her ability to manage a household and bear children. Failure in either role could lead to ridicule, suspicion, even shame. Imagine the whispers in the village if a marriage produced no heirs. Questions swirled. Was it the husband's fault? Or the wife's? Remedies ranged from herbal brews to pilgrimages to relics, anything to spark fertility. Yet, amidst the struggles, affection was possible. We glimpse it in letters, in poems, in chronicles. A husband writing fondly of his wife's laughter. A wife praising her husband's patience. These moments remind us that marriage, while often transactional, could blossom into real love. And still, disappointment lingered for many. Think of the noblewoman married off at 15 to a man twice her age. Or the peasant girl promised to a neighbor she barely knew. Love might come later, or it might never come at all. Infidelity happened. Affairs, secret meetings, even scandals. The church condemned it harshly, but human desire is stubborn. Some looked outside marriage for passion, risking reputation and ruin. Others resigned themselves to cold companionship, quietly enduring. But perhaps the truest measure of medieval marriage lies not in passion or despair, but in endurance. Two people bound together, for better or worse, surviving the winters, sharing the burdens, raising the children, keeping the household alive. Romance was not always fireworks. It was the shared glance across a smoky hearth, the sound of laughter during chores, the comfort of another body on freezing nights. And yes, sometimes it was also the sigh of frustration, the argument about coin, the bitter silence after words spoken in anger. Marriage, like life itself, was a mix. Affection and disappointment. Joy and grief. Hope and resignation. And for every troubadour singing of courtly love, there were countless unnamed couples simply carrying on. Not in poems, not in legend, but in the quiet rhythm of survival. Marriage in the Middle Ages was, by design, supposed to last until death. And death, well, death was never far away. Life expectancy was short. Wars, childbirth, famine, disease, death slipped into homes with unnerving regularity. Which meant that many marriages ended not by choice, but by the grave. Widowhood was common. Very common. A woman might find herself widowed in her 20s. A man could be left alone in middle age, with young children clinging to him. And suddenly, life shifted. For widows, the rules were complicated. The church encouraged chastity, remain loyal to your departed husband, dedicate yourself to piety. But society whispered different things. A widow, after all, often held property. She might inherit land, or manage a household. That made her powerful, and power made her valuable. Suitors appeared, sometimes quickly, eager to claim not only her hand, but her assets. For some women, widowhood offered rare freedom. Freed from a husband's authority, they managed estates, signed contracts, even defended their rights in court. Records show widows fighting legal battles with sharp wit and determination. Some chose not to remarry at all, enjoying independence in a world that rarely allowed it. But independence came with risk. A lone woman could face pressure from family, suitors, even the crown. And gossip, always gossip. Too much freedom was suspicious. For men, widowhood carried a different weight. A widower with young children often remarried quickly. Not for romance, but for practicality. Someone needed to run the household, nurse the children, manage the daily grind. Love might be secondary to necessity. And yet, there were second chances. Many remarriages did bring affection. A widow and widower, both weathered by grief, finding comfort in companionship. Or two families arranging a match that, by luck, turned into genuine happiness. Love after loss was not impossible. But remarriage also brought tension. Stepchildren complicated households. Inheritances grew messy. Who owned what? Which child received which field? Family feuds often began at the remarriage table, smoldering for generations. And still, the cycle continued. A widow might remarry 2, even 3 times, outliving multiple husbands. Life was brutal, but also oddly circular. Marriage, widowhood, remarriage, repeat. The church watched closely. Rules tightened and loosened across centuries, but always with the same refrain: marriage was sacred, remarriage was tolerated, but chastity was ideal. Saints' lives praised widows who chose the cloister over the bridal bed. Yet in practice, society ran on alliances, households, and heirs. Remarriage was too useful to forbid. And behind it all, the human heart. Grief lingered. Some widows mourned for years, keeping tokens of their first husbands. Some remarried reluctantly, out of duty. Others embraced new unions with surprising joy, grateful for laughter after loss. There is a quiet dignity in those stories. They remind us that medieval people were not so different from us. They loved, they lost, they hoped again. Widowhood was not an end, but a fork in the road. And remarriage, whether chosen, pressured, or embraced, was another step on life's uneven path. Second chances existed. Not always happy. Not always free. But always human. Love was not just practical in the Middle Ages. It was not just legal contracts, dowries, and alliances. Love also carried a shimmer of the mystical. A sense that unseen forces, saints, spirits, even the stars, had a hand in who loved whom. Superstition hummed beneath everyday life. A girl might pluck petals from a flower, whispering, "He loves me not." A boy might carry a charm sewn into his tunic, hoping it would keep a sweetheart faithful. These rituals were not written in law, but they were written in the hearts of people who longed for love. Omens mattered. If you dreamed of bread, it foretold abundance. If you dreamed of fire, passion. If a bird flew across your path on the way to meet a lover, well, better pay attention to which way it flew. Every sign could mean something. Herbs were woven into this world. Rosemary for remembrance. Basil for affection. Rue to ward off unwanted advances. Women brewed potions, some harmless teas, others closer to sorcery. Men carried tokens, rings, or even bones said to bring good fortune in romance. Love charms were whispered about in villages, traded like secrets, hidden from priests. But the church noticed and condemned. Love magic was dangerous, sinful, suspicious. Yet people kept using it. Because desire is stronger than doctrine. Astrology played its part. Noble families sometimes consulted the stars before approving marriages. Was the union blessed by the heavens? Or cursed by a poorly aligned planet? Astrologers found work predicting not just battles, but honeymoons. The cosmos, it seemed, had opinions on love. Folk rituals were simpler. A girl might toss apple peels over her shoulder, hoping they would fall in the shape of her future husband's initials. On certain nights, especially midsummer, young people performed games meant to reveal future lovers. Candles, mirrors, whispered chants in the dark. Half play, half fear, all desire. There were darker edges, too. Spells to bind a lover against their will. Curses cast on rivals. Bitter herbs slipped into drinks. Some of these stories read more like nightmares than fairy tales. And while priests thundered against such practices, records show cases tried in courts, accusations of bewitching someone into love, or of poisoning marriages with charms. Even weddings carried layers of superstition. Knots were tied, literally, to bind the couple. Salt was sprinkled for protection. Shoes were thrown, bells rung, all to ward off spirits or ensure fertility. The sacred and the superstitious blurred into one seamless ritual. For peasants, these practices were often playful. For nobles, they could be deadly serious. Imagine a court where a single whispered rumor of enchantment might ruin reputations. Where queens and mistresses were accused of witchcraft simply because their beauty captivated a king. Love, power, and superstition danced together in dangerous steps. And yet, beneath it all, the heart remained the same. People wanted to believe that love was more than chance. That signs, omens, and rituals could tilt fate in their favor. That there was some magic in the world guiding them toward another soul. It is easy, from our distance, to laugh at apple peels, charms, and whispered spells. But are we so different? We still read horoscopes, check compatibility charts, look for signs in the smallest things. We still hope the universe has a plan for love. The medieval world wrapped that hope in ritual, in superstition, in the quiet poetry of omens. And though priests scowled and courts punished, people carried on, lighting candles, casting lots, whispering charms. Because love, in every age, feels a little like magic. The setting is not Europe now. Not the castles, not the peasants, not the church. We move eastward. To the steppes. Vast, open, endless. A world of grassland stretching beyond the horizon, where the sky feels larger than the earth itself. Here lived the Massagetae. A people the Greeks barely understood. Nomads, fierce horsemen, hunters of the plains. They did not build cathedrals or palaces. Their wealth was measured in herds, in horses, in strength. Their lives were mobile, woven into the rhythm of the seasons. And at their head stood a queen. Tomyris. A name that still echoes with steel and legend. She was not the product of courtly love or dynastic marriage. She was a ruler, a warrior, a mother. And she would face down one of the greatest conquerors the ancient world had ever known. Cyrus the Great. Founder of the Persian Empire. A man whose shadow stretched across continents. He had conquered kingdoms, humbled empires, built one of the largest realms in history. His army was disciplined, vast, unstoppable. And yet, even Cyrus hungered for more. His eyes turned to the steppes. To the Massagetae. To Tomyris. The clash seemed inevitable. He, the emperor of half the known world. She, the queen of nomads who answered to no crown. To Cyrus, the Massagetae were another people to absorb, another conquest to secure his empire's edge. To Tomyris, Persia was an intruder, a threat to her people's freedom. But before war came marriage. Or at least the suggestion of it. Ancient sources whisper that Cyrus sought Tomyris' hand. A political move, of course. Unite the Massagetae through her. Control them without bloodshed. But Tomyris refused. She would not be absorbed by a man who devoured nations. Her people would not become one more ornament in the Persian crown. And so, Cyrus marched. The Persian army crossed rivers, dragged supplies, stretched into the wilderness. Cyrus built bridges, forts, supply lines, his machine of empire grinding forward into the grasslands. He expected resistance, yes, but not what was waiting for him. Because Tomyris was not a woman to be underestimated. She knew the terrain. She knew her people. And she knew how to fight on horseback, how to strike from the open fields. Her warriors were not bound by city walls or siege engines. They were the storm itself. The two forces circled each other, like wolves testing for weakness. Skirmishes broke out. Ambushes. Scouts vanishing into the endless horizon. Cyrus's men were disciplined, armored, drilled. Tomyris' people were swift, fierce, unpredictable. Each side studied the other, waiting for the fatal mistake. And then, Cyrus tried a trick. A trap, set with wine and food, designed to lure the Massagetae into a careless feast. Some of Tomyris' warriors fell into it. They drank, they ate, they were slaughtered. Among the dead was her son. Grief turned to fury. And fury became destiny. Tomyris sent word to Cyrus, sharp as a blade. You have taken my son with your trick. But I swear by the sun, I will give you your fill of blood. The message was not poetry. It was a curse, a promise, a declaration of war. And so, the stage was set. Not just a battle of armies, but a battle of wills. Cyrus the Great, who had conquered empires. Tomyris, queen of the steppes, mother in mourning, lioness with claws unsheathed. The plains waited. The sky above was endless. And blood, as Tomyris promised, was about to be spilled. The day of reckoning came. The Persians, disciplined and armored, stood like a wall of iron across the plains. Rows of spears, shields, and archers glinting in the sun. Behind them, cavalry, chariots, and the great weight of empire itself. Facing them, Tomyris and the Massagetae. Fierce riders, their horses restless beneath them. No polished bronze armor, no decorated shields. Just hardened leather, sharp blades, and the wild freedom of the steppe in their veins. The horizon was their fortress, the wind their ally. The clash was inevitable. But first, the words. Tomyris had already warned Cyrus. She had sworn to drown him in blood. And those words were not metaphor, they were prophecy. Cyrus believed in strategy. He had crushed armies with cunning. And so again, he sought to deceive. He arranged another trap. His men abandoned a lavish camp, tables heavy with roasted meats, amphorae brimming with wine, comforts designed to seduce. This time, Tomyris was ready. Her people had been warned. They would not stumble again into drunken slaughter. Instead, they prepared for war. The signal was given. The Massagetae rode forward. Horses thundered, hooves tearing at the earth. Bows sang. Arrows darkened the sky. Spears met shields. The clash was thunderous, chaotic, merciless. The Persians fought in formation. Ordered ranks, precise commands. But the Massagetae were not bound by order. They were the storm. They struck from the flanks, circled, cut, vanished, returned. Their horses seemed part of them, bending with every command. And in the heart of that storm, Tomyris herself. She was no distant queen, no commander on a hill. She rode with her people, blade in hand, grief fueling every strike. Her presence was more than leadership, it was fury incarnate. The battle raged. The Persians, weighed down by armor, fought bravely but found themselves dragged apart. Their discipline fractured by the relentless swarm. Cyrus pressed his men forward, holding the line, refusing to yield. But the line bent, and bent again. The sun climbed higher. The fields grew thick with bodies. Horses screamed. Steel rang against steel. The grass drank deeply. And then, Cyrus fell. How exactly, we cannot know. Herodotus, the great teller of this tale, claims Cyrus died there, struck down in the fury of combat. Perhaps he was surrounded. Perhaps he stood too deep in the fray. Perhaps he met Tomyris herself. The details blur, but the outcome does not. Cyrus the Great, the man who had defeated kingdoms, who had built an empire from the ruins of others, was no more. The Persian army broke. Without their king, their order collapsed. Men fled, trampled one another, scattered across the plains. The Massagetae pursued, cutting them down as they ran. The day belonged to Tomyris. And then, came the fulfillment of her oath. Herodotus tells it this way. After the battle, Tomyris had Cyrus's body brought before her. She looked upon the man who had sought to make her his bride, who had killed her son, who had marched with arrogance into her land. And she spoke. Calm. Cold. Final. You have destroyed my son by trickery. But as I swore, I will give you your fill of blood. And then, she ordered his head severed. A wineskin, filled with human blood, was brought forth. And into it, Cyrus's head was plunged. Soaked in blood. Drowned in it. As she had promised. Whether it happened exactly so, we cannot know. Herodotus, after all, loved a dramatic flourish. Perhaps Tomyris simply left Cyrus among the dead. Perhaps she took his head as a trophy, as warriors often did. But the story, true or not, endures. Because the truth is this, Cyrus the Great died on the steppe. His empire halted by a queen who refused to bend. Tomyris, a woman dismissed by kings, toppled a conqueror who had thought himself unstoppable. The world remembers him as the Great. But it remembers her too. Not as a footnote, but as the one who proved that even the mightiest can bleed. The wind swept across the battlefield. The horizon stretched on, endless. The Massagetae rode home. And in the silence that followed, legend took root. The story of Tomyris is dramatic, yes. But it is also a window. A glimpse into a world that most ancient chroniclers did not understand. To them, nomads were barbarians. People without cities, without walls, without civilization. But that was only half the truth. Steppe cultures lived differently. Not less. Not worse. Differently. Their world was the open plain. Their homes, tents of felt, wood, and hide. Portable. Collapsible. Movable in a day's notice. A settlement could vanish overnight and reappear 100 miles away. Livestock was wealth. Horses, sheep, cattle, camels, these were the currency of survival. Herds fed the family, clothed them, and carried them across the earth. A stolen herd was a fortune lost. A thriving herd meant security, status, power. And horses, horses were everything. To ride was to live. To fight was to ride. A child of the steppe could sit a saddle before they could walk steadily. Horses were not tools, they were extensions of the body. The bond was so deep that empires trembled at the sound of their hooves. Greek writers tried to describe this. They wrote of the Scythians, cousins of the Massagetae, whose arrows seemed to appear from nowhere. They wrote of warriors with tattoos, cloaks of fur, drinking cups made from the skulls of enemies. Were all those details true? Perhaps. Or perhaps the Greeks embroidered the image, making nomads seem more monstrous than real. But archaeology confirms much. The frozen burial mounds of the Scythians reveal golden ornaments, embroidered clothes, intricate weaponry. These were not crude people. They had artistry, ritual, belief. They honored their dead with ceremony, with sacrifice, with treasures buried for eternity. And their women, well, their women were not cloistered in silence. Steppe cultures often allowed women to ride, to fight, to lead. Tomyris was not an anomaly. She was a continuation. In some Scythian graves, women are found buried with bows and swords, their skeletons scarred with the marks of battle. The Greeks may have invented the myth of the Amazons, but the women who inspired it were real enough. The steppe itself shaped these societies. To live in such openness meant no walls to hide behind. Defense was speed. Safety was distance. And survival, always survival, demanded flexibility. A drought? Move. An invasion? Scatter, regroup, strike back. To outsiders, this looked like chaos. To the nomads, it was life's rhythm. And with mobility came power. Because mobility meant connection. Steppe nomads controlled the arteries of trade long before empires paved them in stone. From the Black Sea to China, goods crossed these lands: furs, horses, slaves, silk. A Persian king might build a road, yes. But before the road, there was already a track. A rider. A caravan. A guide who knew the stars and the rivers. Yet there was always tension. Between settled and nomadic. Between farmer and herder. Between wall and saddle. Empires called nomads raiders. Nomads called empires thieves of land. It was a dance of hostility and dependence, repeated for centuries. The Persians fought Tomyris. The Romans feared the Huns. The Chinese built walls to keep out the Xiongnu. And later, much later, the Mongols would turn the whole world upside down. But here, in the days of Tomyris, the lesson was clear. Do not mistake the absence of palaces for weakness. Do not mistake the absence of written laws for ignorance. The steppe had its own laws, its own power, its own kind of greatness. The Greeks and Persians told their stories. They remembered the shock of being defeated by a queen of riders. They painted the steppe as wild, alien, unknowable. But for those who lived it, there was nothing alien. Only the wind, the herds, the endless horizon. And the knowledge that the earth itself was wide enough to be both home and battlefield. Tomyris was not the first. She was not the last. She was one flame in a long fire. A fire that burned across centuries. The fire of the nomad world. Tomyris was not alone. Her story, yes, dramatic, bloody, unforgettable, is part of a much larger chorus. Across centuries, across continents, women stepped onto the battlefield. They led armies. They defied empires. They wrote their names in the smoke of burning cities. Take Boudica. 1,000 years after Tomyris, in the cold lands of Britain, she rose against Rome. A queen of the Iceni, a woman wronged, humiliated, brutalized. The Romans had taken her lands, flogged her, violated her daughters. And in answer, she lit a fire. Her rebellion swept across Britain. Roman towns burned. Legions were slaughtered. For a moment, just a moment, it looked as though she might drive Rome out entirely. The image of her, tall and fierce, hair streaming like fire, riding her chariot across the field, haunts the Roman imagination still. She lost, yes. But the rebellion seared her name into history. Then, Zenobia. 3rd century, Palmyra. A desert queen who dared to carve her own empire between Rome and Persia. Learned, multilingual, ambitious beyond measure. She claimed descent from Cleopatra. She conquered Egypt, defied emperors, and for a time ruled one of the great trade crossroads of the ancient world. Rome eventually crushed her, but not before she bent the empire to attention. And then, there is Tomyris. Different lands, different centuries, same defiance. A queen who refused a marriage of submission, who met an emperor in open war, who stood victorious over Cyrus himself. She and Boudica and Zenobia share no bloodline, no single culture. What binds them is something deeper. A refusal to bow. A willingness to bleed. A knowledge that queens could command not just courts but armies. Herodotus, Roman chroniclers, Byzantine scribes, most of them wrote reluctantly about such women. They exaggerated, they embellished, they often judged. But even through the layers of bias, one truth is clear: the world could never quite silence them. And it wasn't just the famous. Across nomadic cultures, across tribal societies, women fought. Archaeology whispers their stories. Graves filled with weapons. Bones scarred with the marks of battle. These were not rare exceptions. They were participants. Partners in survival, in conquest, in defense. The myth of the Amazons, the legendary race of warrior women, was, perhaps, never purely myth. Greek imagination exaggerated, yes. But it was fed by reality. By encounters with Scythian and Sarmatian women who rode as fiercely as their brothers. To the Greeks, it seemed alien. To the steppe, it was simply life. And so, when we tell Tomyris' story, we are not telling an isolated legend. We are placing her in a lineage of resistance. Of women who refused the script written for them. Of women who took up arms in a world that insisted power was a man's domain. Empires feared them. Chroniclers twisted them. But their shadows endured. And their legacy reminds us of a simple, enduring truth, that history is not the story of men alone. It is the story of those who defied, who led, who broke the silence. Queens of blood and iron. Queens who stared into the eyes of empire and said, no. Tomyris' voice echoes in Boudica's chariot, in Zenobia's desert walls, in every woman who ever stood against the tide of conquest. A legacy carved not in marble, but in fire. Picture the steppe again. Not as wilderness. Not as emptiness. But as a road. An invisible one, yes, but a road nonetheless. Stretching from the edges of Europe all the way to China. The world's largest open highway, made not of stone or wood, but of grass and sky. For centuries, this road carried more than herds. It carried people. Languages. Ideas. Armies. Goods. Empires. The steppe was not a void between civilizations, it was the bridge that bound them together. Take the Scythians. The Greeks feared them, but they also traded with them. Grain for horses. Wine for furs. Gold for slaves. The Black Sea became a marketplace where the nomadic and the settled met, clashed, and bargained. Take the Silk Road. Often imagined as a string of caravans winding through deserts and oases. But in truth, so much of it cut across the steppe. Riders carrying silk westward. Traders driving horses eastward. Nomads guiding, taxing, sometimes raiding. The very flow of global commerce depended on these vast grasslands. And with trade came culture. Music, stories, technologies, slipping across borders that no walls could contain. A bow designed in one valley might appear 1,000 miles away. A melody hummed in one tent could echo in another empire. Mobility was connection. But mobility was also danger. Because the same highway that carried goods carried war. The Huns thundered into Europe. The Turks carved out kingdoms. The Mongols, later still, would knit the world together in conquest and terror. Each wave reminded the empires of the settled world that walls, no matter how tall, could never keep out the riders forever. This duality, the steppe as bridge and as blade, defined history for centuries. Empires rose and fell on its edges. Rome trembled at its horsemen. China raised walls of stone. Persia, Greece, Byzantium, all of them danced this uneasy dance with the horizon. And yet, we must not think of the nomads only as destroyers. Too often history paints them with one brush: raiders, barbarians, the storm on the edge of order. But the truth is more complicated. They were connectors, facilitators, innovators. The saddle, the stirrup, the composite bow, all gifts of the steppe. Without them, the armies of Europe and Asia would have fought very differently indeed. And in their mobility was a lesson. A reminder that human life does not always need walls to flourish. That civilization can be built on movement as much as on stone. That permanence is not the only path to power. When we look at Tomyris, when we look at her people, we see more than a queen and a battlefield. We see part of this wider story. A culture that could move, adapt, strike, and survive in a world that underestimated it. And centuries later, when trains cut across America, when rails carve through mountains and prairies, we will see the echo. Because the struggle between nomadic freedom and settled expansion never truly vanished. It simply changed landscapes. But that is for later. For now, linger on the image, the endless steppe as the great highway of human history. Hooves beating the earth. Wheels rattling across grass. Caravans and armies alike, bound by the same horizon. A road without end. Lift your eyes from the grass. Look upward. To the sky. To the vast, unbroken dome above the steppe. For the nomads who lived here, the sky was not just scenery. It was God. It was fate. It was the endless witness to their lives. They called it many names. Tengri. Father Sky. The Eternal Blue. Across the Scythians, the Sarmatians, the later Turks and Mongols, belief in the sky as a living power endured. A force that gave victory, or took it away. A presence both intimate and infinite. Religion, for the steppe, was not locked inside temples. It was not chanted in marble halls. It was breathed in the open air, under the stars, in the wind that whistled across the plains. Priests? Shamans? Yes, they were there. Figures who spoke with spirits, who read omens in the flight of birds, in the crackle of fire, in the patterns of bones tossed upon the ground. But these were not distant authorities. They were guides, mediators, often women as well as men. In a world so dangerous, so uncertain, the role of the shaman was essential. To heal, to counsel, to divine. And their gods were not countless. This was not the crowded pantheon of Greece, or the endless bureaucracy of Rome's deities. It was elemental. Sky above. Earth below. Sun and moon. Ancestors, always watching. The forces that sustained life, or took it away, honored with offerings of horse, milk, or blood. Death, too, was not an end but a passage. Graves uncovered by archaeologists reveal horses buried beside their riders. Weapons laid carefully across the chest. Gold stitched into clothing, sometimes placed in the mouth. To ride into the afterlife, one needed one's mount, one's tools, one's symbols of rank. The tombs of noblewomen were no less armed, proof again that the steppe did not imagine only men upon the battlefield. Fire was sacred. So was water. The cycle of seasons was sacred. A storm was not just weather, it was judgment, or blessing, depending on how it struck. To live on the steppe was to live in a world where nature was never passive. Every gust of wind, every roll of thunder, every eclipse was part of a conversation between humans and the sky. And it was this spirituality that gave their wars a different tone. When Tomyris stood against Cyrus, when she swore to quench his thirst with blood, she was not only speaking as a queen. She was invoking the eternal witness above her. She was binding her people to the oath under the sky's gaze. To betray such a vow was unthinkable. The steppe belief system was not written in books. It was sung, remembered, performed. Songs told of ancestors, of heroes, of spirits that guarded or haunted. Even today, fragments linger in Central Asian traditions, echoes of the same sky worship, the same reverence for open horizons. And there is a beauty here, in recognizing that the greatest temple they knew was the world itself. No marble was needed. No altar carved in stone. The sky was enough. The earth was enough. The fire was enough. It was, in its way, a faith both humble and immense. Humble, because it bowed to forces larger than humanity. Immense, because it gave every rider, every shepherd, every child on the steppe a direct connection to the eternal. No walls stood between them and their gods. When we speak of the nomads as warriors, we must remember this spiritual core. They did not fight only for land, or for loot, or for revenge. They fought beneath a sky that judged. They fought for honor that would echo into eternity. And sometimes, that faith gave them a resilience that empires, with all their wealth and temples, could never match. Imagine it. A night on the steppe. The fire burning low. Horses tied nearby. Above, the stars, so sharp, so endless. A shaman murmurs chants, the smoke rising like a prayer. And in the silence, you understand, this is not emptiness. This is a world filled with meaning. A world alive. That was the spiritual heart of the nomads. A faith in sky and earth, in spirit and fire. A belief that every breath was taken under the gaze of eternity. Nomads and empires. Two ways of life. Two visions of the world. Always circling, always colliding. The nomads, fluid, mobile, bound to the sky. The empires, fixed, settled, bound to stone. For the nomads, wealth was measured in herds, in horses, in freedom of movement. For the empires, wealth was measured in land, in cities, in walls that marked borders. One saw the world as horizon. The other as territory. And so, tension was inevitable. The Persians learned it, when Cyrus met Tomyris. The Romans learned it, when Boudicca's rebellion and later the Huns shook their frontiers. The Chinese learned it, building wall after wall to hold back riders from the north. Each side looked at the other with equal astonishment. To the empire, the nomads were wild, unpredictable, uncivilized. They had no cities, no marble temples, no libraries. To the nomad, the empire was trapped, rooted, chained, soft. They wondered how people could live in one place forever, behind walls, never free to follow the horizon. Trade linked them. War divided them. And in between, an uneasy dance of tribute, treaties, and betrayals. The Silk Road flourished because nomads allowed it. They guided caravans. They taxed merchants. Sometimes they raided those same caravans, because why not? To the empires, this was infuriating. To the nomads, it was just another way of surviving. And yet, the empires needed them. Horses of the steppe filled imperial armies. Nomadic mercenaries fought in Roman legions, in Persian ranks, in Chinese wars. Their skills were too valuable to ignore. Their mobility too unmatched to replace. But still, the clash persisted. Because beneath the trade, beneath the temporary alliances, lay a deeper conflict of worldview. The empire said, build. The nomad said, move. The empire said, stay. The nomad said, go. Neither was wholly right. Neither wholly wrong. But the tension between them drove centuries of history. Walls were built. Armies marched. Cities fell. And yet, always, the steppe remained. Tomyris' war with Cyrus was only one chapter. The Huns sweeping into Europe. the Turks building kingdoms in Anatolia, the Mongols uniting under Genghis Khan to create the largest land empire in history, all of it sprang from the same clash. Horizon against stone. Rider against settler. And perhaps this is why the stories of these encounters feel so dramatic. They are not just battles of armies. They are battles of ways of being. The settled world offered permanence, architecture, bureaucracy. The nomadic world offered freedom, speed, resilience. When they met, it was never quiet. And as history turns forward, the echoes will not fade. For even in the modern age, when rails replace horses, when trains replace caravans, the old tension will surface again. The question remains, do we move, or do we stay? Do we cling to walls, or chase horizons? That is the clash of worlds. A clash that shaped empires. A clash that shaped the very map of history. Cyrus the Great. Few rulers earn the word great and keep it. But Cyrus did. Even in his downfall. Even in the story where Tomyris defeats him. His name endures. Why? Because Cyrus was not only a conqueror. He was a builder. A weaver of peoples. A man who stitched together one of the first true empires of the world, the Achaemenid Persian Empire. He conquered Lydia, Babylon, lands that stretched from the Aegean to the Industry. Yet he did not simply crush them. He absorbed them. He allowed diversity, religion, and culture to coexist under his rule. To the Jews in Babylon, he was a liberator. He let them return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. To the Medes, he was both ruler and partner. Even his enemies spoke of him with respect. Greek historians, not known for praising foreign kings, described him as noble, just, almost mythic. He became the archetype of the wise conqueror, the ruler who combined strength with tolerance. And then, his death. The great conqueror cut down not by an empire greater than his, not by a mighty city, but by a queen of the steppe. Tomyris. Herodotus seizes on this irony. The man who had brought empires to heel is undone by a woman whose people left no palaces, no marble inscriptions. A story that reads almost like a moral. A warning to hubris. But legend is not erased by death. In Persia, Cyrus remained the father of the nation. His tomb at Massagetae became a place of reverence. Alexander the Great, centuries later, stood before it and wept. Rome invoked his name. Renaissance thinkers admired him as the model of rulership. Even modern statesmen, centuries apart, studied his governance as a template for empire. And so we have this strange duality. In Tomyris' story, he is the defeated. His head, dipped in blood, a warning to all. In world memory, he is the triumphant founder, the wise king, the ruler to emulate. Which is true? Perhaps both. History allows for contradictions. One person can be hero and victim, conqueror and conquered, remembered and forgotten, all depending on who tells the tale. And this is the lesson. Tomyris triumphed on the battlefield. Cyrus triumphed in the memory of civilizations. Both victories matter. Both shaped the centuries that followed. Because empire is not just about soldiers. It is about stories. And the story of Cyrus, even ending in death, was too powerful to fade. His ideals of rulership, whether fully real or partly imagined, left marks that echo in politics, in philosophy, in the very way we think about power. When we think of empire, we think of Cyrus. When we think of resistance, we think of Tomyris. And so, together, they form a balance. Two figures locked in eternal dialogue. Queen and king. Steppe and city. Horizon and stone. That is the enduring legend of Cyrus. Not simply how he died, but how he is remembered. History does not move in straight lines. It weaves, it loops, it circles back. Yet, there are moments where it feels like a door slams shut, and another creaks open. The nomads rode with freedom. They followed herds, water, the shifting seasons. Their paths were marked by hoofprints, not borders. Their stories traveled by memory, sung across campfires. Theirs was a world of horizons. Then came empire. Then cities. Then roads. Cyrus stitched together one kind of order. Rome paved another. The Mongols, ironically, combined both nomad energy and imperial ambition. And yet, even they lived under the sky, their tents rising and falling with the seasons. But the modern world? It was not made of felt or hide, but of iron. Iron rails, hammered into landscapes. Rails that did not shift with the seasons. Rails that demanded permanence, that carved through mountains and across plains. The Transcontinental Railroad. A project that, on paper, was simply about moving people and goods. In reality, it was about reshaping an entire continent. About taking the American West, wild, open, free in ways that echoed the ancient steppe, and binding it to the industrial heart of the United States. Think about that shift. For nomads, freedom meant motion without restraint. For the 19th century, freedom was redefined as speed along fixed lines. Movement, yes, but movement controlled, purchased, ticketed. A horse could choose a path. A train could not. That is why this leap matters. Because when we move from the story of Tomyris and Cyrus, from nomadic horizons, into the era of steel and steam, we are not just changing centuries. We are changing what mobility means to human beings. And here lies the thread. Tomyris people lived by resisting control, by slipping through fingers of empire. The railroad, by contrast, was the ultimate assertion of control, a straight line imposed on a land that had never asked for it. To indigenous peoples of the American West, the Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Shoshone, the iron tracks were not progress. They were intrusion. They were the end of a way of life that had survived for centuries. Buffalo herds scattered, rivers crossed by bridges, treaties broken. A rhythm older than Rome itself was silenced by the hiss of steam and the clang of iron. Progress and loss, forever entwined. It has always been so. Cyrus builds, Tomyris resists. Rome paves roads, tribes retreat. Empires write laws, nomads sing laments. The railroad is just the modern verse in this eternal poem. The verse where the steppe becomes steel. The horizon becomes timetable. The wandering fire becomes a whistle at dawn. And yet, like Tomyris, like Cyrus, the story is not just about loss. It is about resilience. Indigenous voices survived. Memories of nomadic ways survived. And the railroad itself, while it carved scars, also stitched together new connections, created new myths, new communities. From steppe to steel. From blood to iron. Humanity, always moving, always redefining what it means to travel, to conquer, to belong. And that brings us to the story of the railroad itself. Not as a line on a map, but as an epic in iron and sweat. An endeavor that demanded mountains be broken, rivers bridged, lives risked. A story of triumph, yes, but also tragedy. Because history rarely gives us one without the other. The year is 1862. The United States is tearing itself apart in civil war. Brother against brother. Cannon smoke curling over fields that once grew corn. And yet, in the middle of this bloodshed, Congress passes an act that imagines something astonishing. The Pacific Railway Act. Why? Because even in chaos, leaders dream of control. They dream of binding East and West, of tying together a fractured nation with steel. A railroad, not just any railroad, but a transcontinental one. From the Missouri River to the Pacific Ocean. A line that would stretch across plains, mountains, deserts. It sounds impossible. But impossibility has never stopped ambition. The vision is simple on paper: one company, Union Pacific, would build westward from Omaha. Another, Central Pacific, would build eastward from Sacramento. Somewhere, someday, the two would meet. In between lay a continent of obstacles, snow-choked Sierra Nevada peaks, burning deserts, rivers with no bridges, and, of course, people who lived there already. Indigenous nations. Buffalo herds. Vast landscapes that had never known iron. The companies, though, saw not land but money. For every mile of track laid, they received government bonds. For every acre of unused land sliced open by rails, they received grants. Suddenly, speed was not only patriotic, it was profitable. The faster they built, the richer they became. Picture the first rails. Teams of men sweating under prairie sun. Wooden ties dropped in place. Iron rails hauled by mule and muscle. Spikes driven in with ringing blows. It was crude, it was grueling, and yet, it was progress, at least as 19th century America defined it. But let's pause here. Because the story is not just about businessmen with grand visions. It's about the people who actually bent their backs to the task. The Union Pacific turned to armies of Irish immigrants, many of them fresh from famine, seeking work and survival. The Central Pacific turned westward, where Chinese immigrants, thousands of them, took up the hammers, the picks, the blasting powder. And let's not romanticize it. This was not the heroic labor of free men building their own dream. This was sweat wrung out for pennies. This was danger every hour. Rockslides in the Sierra. Blizzards that buried camps. Heat that cracked lips and broke men. Explosives that tore apart not just mountains, but bodies. Yet still, mile by mile, the rails grew longer. Across the prairie they ran straight as an arrow. Into the mountains they zigzagged, carved by tunnels blasted through granite. Bridges rose, trestles spanning gorges that had seemed impassable. Imagine it. You're a settler in the 1860s, watching as rails creep closer to your frontier town. At first, it's curiosity. Strange men with strange accents, hammering iron. Then the sound of whistles. Then trains, real trains, belching smoke, carrying goods, people, letters, newspapers. Suddenly, your world is not so far from Boston or San Francisco. The continent shrinks. But for others, the sound of that whistle is not opportunity, it is doom. The buffalo scatter. Hunting grounds are torn apart. Camps are uprooted. The railroad does not simply pass through, it consumes. Indigenous nations knew this. They raided camps, tore up rails, fought to hold their world together. But the momentum of steel was merciless. Progress had a price, and it was measured in more than dollars. It was measured in bones buried beneath the ties. In treaties broken. In herds slaughtered. In languages silenced. Still, to the men at the top, Stanford, Durant, Crocker, Huntington, it was triumph. They boasted of speed, of records broken, of miles laid. They cared little for the cost. History, after all, is often written by the men who sign the checks, not the ones who swing the hammers. And yet, here we are, telling the story differently. Remembering not just the golden spikes, but the blood and sweat beneath them. Because that's what history demands, a full accounting. The first rails were more than iron. They were symbols. Symbols of ambition, greed, unity, and destruction all at once. They marked the beginning of a project that would forever change the American landscape. The Transcontinental Railroad was not just built. It was carved, out of land, out of lives, out of dreams and nightmares alike. Mountains are patient. They do not bend easily. They do not yield simply because humans arrive with hammers and hope. And yet, the Sierra Nevada had to be crossed. There was no avoiding it. If the Central Pacific Railroad was to connect California to the rest of the nation, rails would have to run through solid granite. Imagine it, steep ridges, snow that swallowed men whole, cliffs that dropped away into forests. No gentle pass. No forgiving valley. Just stone, piled high as if the earth itself wanted to remind humanity who was really in charge. The men who faced this task were mostly Chinese immigrants. Thousands of them. Hired because others would not come, and because company bosses quickly realized these men were disciplined, efficient, and, let's be blunt, cheap. Paid less than white workers, given the most dangerous jobs, and yet they endured. Their weapons? Shovels, picks, and nitroglycerin. To tunnel through granite, crews drilled holes by hand, 2 men holding iron rods while a third swung a sledgehammer in rhythm. Strike. Twist. Strike. Twist. All day, all night. Holes deep enough to pack with black powder or, when available, the more volatile nitroglycerin. Then came the blasts. A warning shouted. Fuses lit. Men running. An explosion that cracked the mountain, sending rock flying, sometimes taking lives with it. Then, when the smoke cleared, back they went, digging, hauling, drilling again. Some tunnels stretched hundreds of feet. Progress could be measured in inches per day. Not miles. Not even yards. Inches. And as if granite wasn't enough, winter descended. Snow piled 20 feet deep. Avalanches thundered down, crushing camps, burying tracks that had already been laid. Workers lived in tunnels, in makeshift shelters carved under the drifts. They cooked rice over tiny stoves while the wind screamed outside. Still, they pressed on. Mile by mile, tunnel by tunnel, they carved a path for the rails. It was brutal. It was relentless. And it was invisible. Because when the golden spike was driven years later, photographers did not invite these Chinese laborers to pose. Their sweat was required, but their presence was erased. Think about that. A continent could not be joined without them. And yet, their names were not written. Their faces were cropped out of history's photographs. But history has a way of whispering from the margins. We know now. We can picture them, lanterns glowing in the dark, breath steaming in frozen air, hammers ringing in granite halls. A chorus of anonymous men who carved the future with their hands. The mountains did not yield easily. But they yielded. Steel teeth bit into stone, and slowly, impossibly, the Sierra Nevada was pierced by tunnels, spanned by trestles, conquered not by glory but by endurance. And when the first train finally rolled over those peaks, it was not just a triumph of engineering. It was a monument to stubbornness. To the belief that stone and snow could be broken by sheer will. Mountains are patient. But so, too, are men. And in that patience, a nation was stitched tighter. On May 10, 1869, the earth trembled not from blasting powder but from applause. At Promontory Summit in Utah, 2 iron arms finally reached across the continent and touched. The Union Pacific coming from the east, the Central Pacific from the west. The impossible dream, the Transcontinental Railroad, was complete. A ceremonial golden spike was prepared. A gleaming thing, unnecessary for actual track laying, but perfect for the cameras of history. Telegraph wires had been strung so that the strike of the hammer could be reported instantly across the nation. Imagine it, the first live broadcast of a national event. Towns and cities cheered in real time, bells rang, cannons fired, people toasted in saloons as the telegraph ticked out the words, "Done." It was a moment painted in triumph. The President of the Union Pacific, Leland Stanford of the Central Pacific, government officials, engineers, financiers, all the men of suits and speeches, were there to pose for the cameras. Engines faced each other on the track, their smokestacks practically touching. Champagne corks popped. Men shook hands, grinned, lifted their hats to the photographer. It looked like unity. It looked like destiny fulfilled. But, as always, the camera's frame is selective. Who was missing? The Chinese laborers who had carved tunnels through granite. The Irish workers who had laid endless rails across the plains. The freedmen and Mexican Americans who had swung hammers and hauled ties. They were ordered to stay out of sight. They were not invited to the champagne toasts. The photograph of the golden spike, so famous now, is a picture not of reality but of erasure. And yet, they were there. Watching from the edges. Dust on their clothes, sweat still drying on their brows, eyes narrowed not in triumph but in the quiet knowledge of what they had endured. History did not ask them to smile. But the railroad bore their fingerprints. The golden spike itself was mostly symbolic. It was promptly removed after the ceremony, replaced with an ordinary iron spike to actually hold the rails together. That glittering artifact ended up in a museum, while the workers returned to camps, pay disputes, and the endless labor of maintenance. Progress does not pause after the photo is taken. And then there was the cost. The railroad shortened the distance between New York and San Francisco from months to mere days. It opened markets, moved goods, spread ideas. It was hailed as a triumph of civilization. But it also unleashed consequences that could not be gilded. For Native Americans, the Iron Road was a wound across the land. Bison herds were slaughtered to feed crews or simply shot for sport from train windows, their numbers dwindling from millions to near extinction. Tribes who had lived for centuries along the plains and mountains were pushed, displaced, starved. The steel rails were not neutral, they carried with them an empire's expansion, and the empire was hungry. For the workers, progress meant injury, disease, exhaustion. Explosions took fingers, eyes, lives. Avalanches buried camps. Men froze in the snow of the Sierra, or collapsed in the desert sun of Nevada. Graves dotted the route. Some marked. Most not. But history is often written in selective ink. The golden spike shines in the stories, while the scars lie beneath. And yet, perhaps, both truths must be held. It was a moment of triumph. A line of steel stitched a vast continent together, faster than any road or river ever could. Telegraph poles marched beside it, carrying voices at the speed of electricity. Goods, people, and ideas now moved on a timetable that bent the shape of life itself. A farmer in Nebraska could send wheat to San Francisco. A letter from Boston could reach Sacramento before ink had barely dried. The sense of isolation, of distance, began to shrink. The United States was, at last, a connected thing. But connection always comes with a price. And the men who toasted with champagne that day were not the ones who paid it. So when we picture that moment, two locomotives nose to nose in the Utah sun, men shaking hands, cameras clicking, we should also imagine the hands blistered by hammers, the faces blackened by powder smoke, the shoulders bent from hauling ties. We should hear the voices that were not invited to speak. Because the golden spike did not just symbolize triumph. It symbolized sacrifice. And in the silence after the cheers, the echo of hammers remained. History does not move in straight lines. It meanders. It pauses. It loops back on itself, like a wandering stream that eventually finds its way to the sea. And yet, whether in medieval villages, on Persian battlefields, or across the granite bones of the Sierra Nevada, there is always the same undercurrent: people. Their choices. Their stubbornness. Their hunger for connection. We began with medieval dating, that awkward dance of glances and contracts, of festivals and dowries. The medieval world told us that love was rarely just love. It was strategy. It was survival. A match could determine inheritance, land, alliances. And yet, despite the politics, there were moments of laughter, of stolen touches at a fair, of whispered words in the dark. Even in a world of arranged unions, human hearts found cracks in the armor of custom. Then we turn to Queen Tomyris, standing against Cyrus the Great. A woman who had every reason to bend, but chose instead to fight. She was not remembered for softness, but for defiance. When Cyrus fell, his empire-stretching ambition ended in a pool of blood. Tomyris stood as proof that the great can be broken, and that power is not eternal. And finally, the railroad. Steel laid across plains and peaks, hammered by hands whose names we may never know. A project that shrank a continent and expanded a nation. It was a triumph, yes, but also a scar. Progress tends to be both. At first glance, these stories do not belong together. A medieval peasant fumbling through courtship, a warrior queen drenched in vengeance, a rail line spiked into the earth. But listen closely and they rhyme. What is courtship if not an attempt to stitch two lives together? What is conquest if not an attempt to stitch empires together? What is a railroad if not an attempt to stitch a continent together? The methods differ. The costs differ. But the impulse, the desire to bind, to connect, to reach across distance, is the same. And always, there is a price. The medieval girl who married for her father's land. The son who bent to his family's will. They paid the price of duty. Tomyris, who fought for her people, paid in blood, hers and others. The workers who carved through granite paid in exhaustion, injury, and silence. The golden spike glitters. But so, too, does the ring slipped onto a finger at a medieval church porch. And the head of Cyrus the Great, dropped into a skin of blood, grisly as it is, also glitters with the stubborn shine of a people unwilling to yield. Connection, defiance, endurance. 3 different ages. 3 different stories. But one human thread. Because history is not only kings and dates, nor only inventions and treaties. It is the stubborn insistence of people who, faced with difficulty, refuse to stop. Picture them together for a moment. A medieval boy, clutching a garland of flowers, stepping nervously toward the girl he hopes to woo at a midsummer dance. Tomyris, standing tall against the smoke of battle, her eyes steady as she delivers justice to a king. A Chinese laborer, lantern in hand, crouched in a granite tunnel, waiting for the fuse to burn down. They will never meet. They belong to centuries and continents apart. And yet, they share something. A willingness to risk, to reach, to endure. And that is why we tell their stories. Not because they are the same, but because they remind us that across time, across place, the human heart beats with familiar rhythms. Love. Defiance. Progress. Messy, painful, imperfect, but relentless. So when you next ride a train, or pass a couple whispering to each other, or hear of a leader standing firm against impossible odds, think of the thread that ties them together. Think of the golden spike, the dowry contract, the warrior queen's vow. Different tools. Different weapons. Same story. History may not move in straight lines. But it does rhyme. And its rhymes are written not just in books, but in us. So tonight, as we leave medieval fairs, Scythian battlefields, and snowy tunnels behind, let us carry their echoes forward. Because the past is never truly past. It hums beneath our feet, steady as the rails. And like a train rounding the final bend, our journey has reached its station. But the track stretches on. Always on.